This wasn't meant to surface, but something buried for years has just cracked open, and the timing couldn't be worse. Behind sealed doors, a single move has triggered panic, betrayal, and a race against the clock. And now, one question refuses to stay quiet. Who just turned the game upside down? The call didn't come through official channels. No palace operator. No assistant. Just a direct, encrypted line that rang once, then silence. And yet, that single moment was enough to shift everything inside the Montecito estate. Prince Harry didn't hesitate. He stepped away from the room, his expression already tightening before he even answered. Because deep down, he knew calls like this don't come without consequences. On the other end, there was no small talk. No soft entry. Just information. Precise. Measured. And devastating. A deal had been signed. Not quietly. Not speculatively. But formally. Locked in with legal weight and financial backing that couldn't be undone. And the name attached to it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an outsider looking in. It was someone from inside the circle. Someone who had once stood close enough to be trusted. That's when the atmosphere inside the house changed. What had started as a normal morning quickly turned into something far heavier. Staff noticed it first, not through words, but through movement. Doors closing faster. Conversations cut short. Phones being picked up, then put down, then picked up again. Because this wasn't just another rumor floating through tabloids. This was structure. This was documentation. And most dangerously, this was timing. Within minutes, Meghan had been informed. And unlike Harry, she didn't react with confusion. She reacted with calculation. Because she understood what this meant far faster than anyone else in that room. This wasn't about headlines. This was about control. For years, their narrative had been carefully built, layer by layer, appearance by appearance, interview by interview. Every word placed with intention. Every silence equally strategic. But now, someone else was preparing to tell a version of that story. And not from the outside, looking in, but from the inside, looking out. That's the part that changed everything. Because when the source of information comes from proximity, not speculation, it carries a different kind of weight. A kind that doesn't just spark curiosity, it creates doubt. And doubt is dangerous, especially when it reaches the level of contracts. Because buried inside their biggest deals, streaming, publishing, partnerships, there exists one clause that matters more than any other. Authenticity, not emotion, not perspective, but verifiable truth. And if that truth is ever challenged, legally, publicly, or structurally, the consequences don't arrive slowly. They arrive all at once. That's exactly the scenario now forming behind the scenes. Because this deal wasn't just about telling a story. It was about backing it with records, timelines, and evidence that had been quietly sitting untouched for years. And the origin of that evidence? That's where things become uncomfortable. Because it doesn't lead to a journalist. It doesn't lead to an investigator. It leads back to a place they thought had already been left behind. Frogmore. A house that was never supposed to matter again. A chapter that had already been closed. Except it wasn't. Because while they moved forward, something stayed behind. Not intentionally. Not strategically. But permanently. And for nearly 2 years, that space wasn't empty. It was occupied. Lived in. Observed. And slowly understood. Which means this isn't just about something being written now. This is about something being collected then. And only now finally being used. That realization hit Harry harder than anything else. Because betrayal from distance is one thing. But betrayal from proximity? That carries a different kind of weight. It forces a single, uncomfortable question to the surface. Who had access? And more importantly, what did they see? Because if even a fraction of what's being suggested is true, then this isn't just a media problem. It's a structural one. One that reaches into contracts, credibility, and everything built since their departure. And as the first wave of calls began, legal teams, advisors, crisis handlers, one thing became painfully clear inside the house. This wasn't something they could ignore. This wasn't something they could spin. And most dangerously, this wasn't something they fully controlled anymore. Because somewhere else, far from Montecito, Someone had already made their move. And they weren't waiting for permission. What they had walked away from was supposed to fade into irrelevance, a closed chapter, a sealed space, a place that no longer held power over their present. But that assumption carried a flaw they never accounted for. Because while they were busy building a new narrative across the Atlantic, something far quieter was happening behind the walls they left behind. Frogmore Cottage didn't sit frozen in time. It didn't remain untouched. It continued, occupied, lived in, and more importantly, observed with a level of proximity no outsider could ever replicate. And that detail changes everything, because when a space is lived in long enough, it begins to reveal patterns. Not intentionally, not dramatically, but gradually, through routines, through overlooked details, through the kind of fragments people don't think twice about leaving behind. And those fragments, they don't disappear. They accumulate, they connect, and eventually, they start forming something far more dangerous than speculation. They form context. For nearly 2 years, that context was quietly building. Not in headlines, not in interviews, but in silence. Every drawer opened, every shelf reorganized, every device reconnected. It all added another layer of understanding. And what makes this even more unsettling is that none of it required intrusion. It didn't require hacking, or chasing, or digging from the outside. It simply required presence. And presence is powerful, because the closer you are to something, the clearer it becomes. The difference between assumption and insight is distance, and in this case, there was none. Whoever stepped into that space wasn't looking at a version of events shaped for the public. They were looking at what had been left behind without an audience in mind. And that's where the shift begins. Because what started as ordinary occupancy slowly transformed into quiet awareness. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but piece by piece. A note here, a pattern there, a timeline that didn't quite align with what had been presented publicly. And once those inconsistencies begin to surface, they don't stay small. They grow. They demand explanation. And more importantly, they invite verification. That's the part that turns this from uncomfortable to dangerous. Because once information moves beyond curiosity and into verification, it stops being a private matter. It becomes something that can be documented, structured, presented, and, if necessary, challenged. Which is exactly what now appears to be happening. Because somewhere along that 2-year stretch, what was being seen wasn't just observed, it was remembered. Not emotionally, not casually, but methodically. Enough to create a sequence. Enough to draw connections. Enough to tell a story that doesn't rely on interpretation, but on alignment. And alignment is hard to argue with, especially when it begins to overlap with timelines the public already recognizes. That's when things start to tighten. Because now, it's no longer about what might have happened. It becomes about what can be shown. And once something can be shown, it moves out of the realm of narrative and into the realm of accountability. Back in Montecito, that realization was starting to settle in. Not all at once, but in fragments, through conversations that felt heavier than they should have, through pauses that lasted just a little too long, through the kind of silence that only exists when people begin to understand the scale of what they're dealing with. Because this wasn't just about someone speaking. This was about someone speaking with access. And access changes the entire equation. It removes distance. It removes doubt. And most importantly, it removes control. Which leaves only one question hanging in the air, unanswered, but impossible to ignore. If everything left behind has now been seen, then how much of it can actually be explained? By the time the third round of calls began, the situation had already moved beyond internal concern. This was no longer about reacting, it was about containment. And the tone inside the room reflected that shift. Voices were lower, sharper, more deliberate. Because now, the question wasn't what is happening, it was how far has this already gone. The first real breakthrough didn't come from speculation. It came from structure. A timeline, not the one that had been publicly shared over the years, but a reconstructed version built quietly, piece by piece, from what had been left behind. Dates that aligned too precisely. Gaps that suddenly didn't feel like gaps anymore. Decisions that, when placed in sequence, no longer looked reactive but pre-planned. And that distinction? It changes everything. Because a reactive story invites sympathy, but a structured one invites scrutiny. Somewhere within that reconstructed timeline, a pattern had begun to form, one that didn't rely on interpretation, but on consistency. Meetings that matched future outcomes. Notes that hinted at direction long before it was publicly acknowledged. Fragments that, on their own, meant very little but together created something far more difficult to dismiss. A framework. And once a framework exists, it can be tested. That's where the legal team started to lean in. Not emotionally, not defensively, but analytically. Because this wasn't about defending public image anymore. This was about anticipating exposure. Every clause, every agreement, every signed contract began to take on a new level of importance, especially the ones tied to content, storytelling, and truth verification. Because buried inside those agreements is a simple expectation that what is presented as truth can withstand challenge. And if it can't, then the consequences don't stay theoretical. They become enforceable. That's the part that started to tighten the pressure. Because if even a portion of this reconstructed timeline were to be validated externally through documents, records, or corroboration, it wouldn't just raise questions. It would trigger mechanisms, reviews, audits, legal reassessments that operate independently of public opinion. And once those processes begin, they don't stop easily. Inside Montecito, that reality was beginning to settle in with uncomfortable clarity. Because this wasn't a situation they could manage through messaging alone. No carefully worded statement, no controlled interview, no strategic silence could fully contain something that had already moved into verification territory. And the most unsettling part? They didn't know exactly what had been verified yet. That uncertainty is what shifts pressure into panic. Because when you don't know what the other side has, you can't predict the next move. You can't prepare a response. You can only react. And reacting means you're already behind. At one point, a simple question was raised in the room. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with enough weight to stop everything else around it. What if this isn't just about the past? Because if the timeline being built doesn't stop at what was left behind, if it extends forward, connecting past actions to present outcomes, then this isn't just a retrospective problem. It's a current one, and possibly a future one. That's when the room shifted again. Because now it wasn't just about what had been seen. It was about what could be proven next. And somewhere else, far from the tension building inside that house, someone was already moving forward, organizing, preparing, aligning everything into a form that wouldn't just raise questions, but demand answers. By the time the fourth phase fully unfolded, the situation had already moved beyond anything that could be quietly contained behind closed doors. What had initially felt like a controlled leak, something that might be managed with careful messaging and calculated silence, was now revealing itself as something far more structured, something designed not just to expose, but to corner. Because this was no longer unfolding randomly, it was unfolding in layers. And each layer was doing exactly what it was meant to do: tighten pressure, limit options, and most importantly, remove time. Inside Montecito, that shift wasn't announced. It was felt. Conversations that once revolved around possibility had now turned into discussions of inevitability. The language changed first. Words like if quietly disappeared, replaced by when. And once that shift happens, once a situation moves from hypothetical to expected, it forces a completely different kind of response. Not proactive, reactive. And reacting, in a situation built on timing, is the first sign that control is already slipping. Because somewhere else, whoever was orchestrating this wasn't reacting at all. They were executing. What made this phase different from everything that came before, it wasn't just the information, it was the delivery. Up until now, everything had existed in fragments. Signals, hints, enough to create tension, but not enough to fully expose the core. But now, the fragments were beginning to connect. And once fragments connect, they stop being harmless. They become narrative. That's when the first real structural threat emerged. Because this wasn't just about what had been seen or remembered anymore. It was about what had been organized. The difference may seem small on the surface, but in reality, it's everything. Observation can be dismissed. Memory can be challenged. But organization? Organization can be presented. And presentation leads to verification. That's the step that changes the entire game. Because once something is organized into a sequence, supported by timestamps, aligned with known events, and structured in a way that can be followed, it no longer depends on belief. It becomes something that can be tested. And if it can be tested, it can be proven. Inside the house, that realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through details. A line from a document. A reference point that matched too precisely. A moment where two separate timelines suddenly overlapped in a way that couldn't be easily explained. At first, it created discomfort, then concern, and now a pressure. Because once patterns begin to emerge, they don't stay contained. They expand outward, pulling other elements into alignment. And the more elements align, the harder it becomes to dismiss the structure as coincidence. That's when the legal implications started to take center stage. Not hypothetically, operationally. Contracts that had once felt like protection were now being re-examined under a completely different lens. Every clause related to truth, accuracy, and representation was being revisited, not to enforce, but to assess risk. Because if the emerging structure contradicted any of those clauses, even partially, it wouldn't just create headlines. It would trigger consequences. And those consequences don't move slowly. They move with precision. Because once a breach is even suspected, processes begin. Internal reviews, external consultations, quiet audits that don't announce themselves until they've already gathered enough to act. And that's the part no one inside Montecito could see clearly. What had already started beyond their view. Because while they were still trying to assess what might be coming, other entities, partners, platforms, stakeholders could already be evaluating what had surfaced so far. Not emotionally, not publicly, but methodically. And methodical reactions are the most dangerous ones. Because they don't make noise. They make decisions. That's when the sense of isolation began to deepen. Because this wasn't just about facing one source anymore. It was about facing a chain reaction. One piece of information leading to another. One verification leading to another. A sequence that, once started, becomes increasingly difficult to interrupt. And the person or people driving that sequence clearly understood this. Because they weren't rushing. They were pacing. That's what made this phase so unsettling. The restraint. Because if the goal had been immediate exposure, everything would have already been released. All at once. Overwhelming. Chaotic. But that's not what was happening. Instead, it was controlled. Measured. Almost surgical. Which means the objective wasn't just to reveal. It was to maximize impact. And maximizing impact requires one key element. Timing. Every release. Every signal. Every piece of information was being positioned to land at the exact moment it would create the greatest pressure. Not too early, where it could be dismissed. Not too late, where it could be contained. But precisely when response options were at their weakest. That's strategy. And strategy doesn't leave room for improvisation. Inside Montecito, that realization brought everything to a standstill. Because once you understand that you're not just dealing with information but with a sequence, you also understand something far more difficult to accept. You're not setting the pace anymore. You're following it. And following means you're already behind. That's when the question of response became almost impossible to answer. Because every option now carried equal risk. Respond publicly and risk validating what hasn't been confirmed. Stay silent and allow the narrative to expand unchecked. Engage legally and trigger discovery processes that could expose even more than what's currently known. There was no clean move left, only calculated risks. And every calculation depended on one unknown variable. How much is still being held back? Because the most dangerous part of this phase wasn't what had already been revealed. It was what hadn't. The gaps. The spaces between the information. Because those gaps weren't empty. They were intentional. They were the parts being saved for later. For the next move. And that's what created the countdown effect. Not a visible clock, but a psychological one. Every hour that passed without clarity increased the pressure. Every delay amplified the anticipation. And anticipation, when paired with uncertainty, becomes something far more powerful than exposure itself. It becomes inevitability, because once people begin to expect something to come out, the impact of that reveal multiplies. It doesn't arrive as a surprise, it arrives as confirmation. And confirmation carries weight. That's when the internal dynamic shifted again, not toward panic, but toward acceptance. Because deep down, everyone in that room began to understand the same thing. This wasn't going to stop. Not here. Not before the next phase. Because too much had already been set in motion. Too many pieces were already aligned. And whoever was behind it had no reason to step back now. Not when they were this close. Not when the pressure had reached this level. And not when the next move had the potential to change everything. Because that's what this entire sequence had been building toward. Not noise. Not speculation. But a moment. A single release that wouldn't just raise questions, but answer them. And once answers begin to surface, real ones, structured ones, verifiable ones, the situation moves beyond narrative entirely. It becomes record, permanent, unavoidable, and impossible to reverse. As the final hours of this phase continued to close in, one truth became impossible to ignore inside Montecito. This was no longer about protecting the past. It was about surviving what comes next. Because somewhere else, beyond the silence and the pressure, the next piece was already prepared, already structured, already timed. And when it arrives, it won't just suggest anything. It will prove it. By the time the fifth phase began, there was no longer any illusion of control left inside Montecito. What had once been a situation they believed they could manage, shape, redirect, outmaneuver, had now fully revealed itself as something operating far beyond their reach. This wasn't a crisis that could be contained with strategy anymore. This was a conclusion unfolding. Because everything up until this point, every signal, every fragment, every calculated release had been leading here, not to speculation, not to pressure alone, but to something far more final. Confirmation. And the difference between pressure and confirmation is irreversible, because pressure gives you time. Confirmation takes it away. Inside the house, that shift didn't come with panic or noise. It came with something far heavier: stillness. The kind of stillness that settles in when every possible outcome has already been considered, and none of them lead to escape. Phones were still active. Conversations were still happening. But the tone had changed completely. No one was asking what could be done anymore. They were asking what would happen next. Because deep down, they already knew. The next move wasn't theirs. It never was. Somewhere else, far from the tension building behind those walls, the final piece was no longer being prepared. It was ready. And what made this moment different, what made it definitive, wasn't just the existence of that final piece, but the structure behind it. Because this wasn't going to arrive as another fragment, another hint, another controlled signal. This was going to arrive as a complete picture, aligned, organized, and most importantly, supported. Because once information reaches that level, it no longer invites debate. It demands acknowledgement. That's the point where narratives collapse. Not because they're attacked, but because they're replaced. Replaced by something stronger. Something structured. Something that doesn't rely on emotion or perspective, but on alignment, consistency, and proof. And proof doesn't argue. It stands. That's what made this phase unavoidable. Because everything that had been quietly building behind the scenes, the timelines, the patterns, the connections, had now reached a point where they could be presented as one unified sequence. Not separate moments. Not isolated details. But a single, continuous line that connected past decisions to present realities. And once that line is visible, it changes how everything is interpreted. Actions that once seemed reactive begin to look intentional. Moments that once felt isolated begin to connect. And a narrative that once felt controlled begins to unravel under its own weight. That's the shift that was now approaching. Not gradually, but all at once. Inside Montecito, that understanding settled in with quiet clarity. Because this wasn't just about what would be revealed. It was about what that reveal would trigger. Because confirmation doesn't exist in isolation. It activates things, processes, reviews, reactions that move independently of public opinion, legal structures that don't respond to emotion, but to evidence. And once those systems begin to move, they don't wait for permission. They proceed. That's the part that made this moment final. Because once those mechanisms are triggered, there's no reversing them. No statement, no interview, no strategic silence can pull them back. At best, they can be managed, slowed, negotiated, but never undone. And that reality changes everything. Because now it's no longer about protecting image. It's about protecting what remains. That's why the atmosphere didn't break into chaos. It tightened, focused. Because when options disappear, clarity takes their place. And the clarity inside that house was simple, but brutal. The next move decides everything. Because once that final piece is released, the situation moves beyond control entirely. It leaves the hands of those involved and enters something far more permanent. Public record. And public record doesn't fade. It doesn't adjust. It doesn't forget. It stays. That's what makes this the true endpoint of the sequence. Not because nothing happens after, but because everything that happens after is a consequence. And consequences don't negotiate. They unfold, slowly for some, rapidly for others, but always in one direction, forward. As the final moments of this phase close in, one question hangs heavier than all the rest. Not what will be revealed, but what happens after it is. Because once the truth, whatever it turns out to be, is fully laid out, the response won't just come from one place. It will come from everywhere. Partners, institutions, audiences, systems that have been watching quietly from the sidelines, waiting for one thing: clarity. And once clarity arrives, decisions follow. Decisions that don't rely on loyalty or perception, but on alignment with what can be proven. That's the moment this entire sequence has been building toward. Not exposure, not reaction, but decision. And decisions, once made at that level, don't reverse easily. Which is why this isn't just the end of a chapter. It's the end of a version of events, a version of control, a version of narrative that, until now, had held its ground. But not anymore. Because the moment that final piece lands, everything shifts. And once it shifts, it doesn't shift back. So now, the only thing left is the reveal itself. And the aftermath that follows it. Because when the final move is made, there are no more layers left to uncover. Only consequences left to face. If you've been following this story closely, if you've been watching how each piece has fallen into place, then you already understand. This wasn't random. It wasn't chaos. It was structure. And what comes next will determine everything that follows. So stay right here. Because when that final piece is revealed, you won't just hear about it later. You'll see it unfold. And when it does, one thing is certain: nothing will look the same again.